Okay, welcome back. And we are working on Rambam's Mishnah Torah, the Hilchos Malachim u'Milchamoseihem, laws of kings and their wars. We're up to chapter 30. Number 1. During a king's reign, he must write a Torah scroll for himself, in addition to the scroll which was left to him by his ancestors. A court of 71 elders should check this scroll to compare it to the Torah scroll that is kept in the temple courtyard. And of course, this one has been checked by previous generations, going all the way back to Moses, so that we know that that one is an accurate one and that there's no changes in letters or errors or mistakes, things like that. It has to be checked against that one. Now, if this king, if his ancestors did not leave him a Torah scroll, or if that scroll had been lost, then he must write a second Torah scroll. So he has to have one that he writes, which is we'll talk about as a commandment upon every person to write their own Torah scroll. And then there's one that he has to have as a king. That's a second one. So the second one, he could have one that he's inherited, if he has inherited one. He must have two Torah scrolls, one in whose writing he is obligated as every individual Israelite, and which he places in his treasury. And then the second one, which should not move from his presence, except when he goes to the bathroom or bath or something like that, or places where it's not appropriate to be learning Torah. So he has to have this with him, and this is, as it says in the Gemara Sanhedrin, chapter 21, it says he should wear it on his arm as an amulet. And it's written in the book of Psalms, chapter 16, verse 8, I have set God before me at all times. He is my right hand. I will not be moved. In other words, the idea is that the king should have this Torah scroll with him at all times, and that he should be learning from it whenever possible. When he goes to war, this scroll should accompany him. When he returns, it should accompany him. When he sits in judgment, it should be with him. When he dines, it should be opposite him. As it says in Deuteronomy, it should accompany him, and he should read it all the days of his life. Chapter 3, for halacha, law number 2, regarding kings. He should not amass many wives. The oral tradition states that he may take no more than 18 wives, and the figure 18 includes both wives and concubines. If he takes an additional wife and has relations with her, he is liable to stripes. It's an important notice there about if he takes another wife and has relations with her. We're going to go back to that in a minute. He is punishable with stripes, lashes. He may divorce one of his wives and marry another instead of the one he divorced, but not going past the number 18. I wanted to make a stop for just a second and talk about this idea of a wife. What's the idea of a wife? When he marries a wife, he consecrates her as his wife in what's called Kiddushin. He sanctifies her, consecrates her as his wife. That's stage number 1. And he accepts upon himself certain financial obligations in regard to her, and that's a kasuba, that's a contractual arrangement. That's stage number 2. The Rambam states that a wife is the one who has Kiddushin and kasuba. A king is allowed to add, he has the privilege of adding a concubine. That privilege is only given to a king, not to others. And we'll come back to that in chapter number 4. We'll come back to the details of this one. So number 1 was he has to have a Torah scroll with him. Number 2, he has not allowed to have more than 18 wives. And number 3, he may not accumulate many horses, only what is necessary for his cavalry. I'm going to come back to the word cavalry. It is even forbidden for him to have one additional horse to run before him, as is customarily done by other kings. If he adds an additional horse, he is to be lashed, he is to be beaten. So, going back to the word here, markefta, for his cavalry, but markefta could also be translated as his chariot, in which case his chariot, as many horses as is needed for his chariot, and that'd be a separate thing. So the idea then is that according to that interpretation, the Rambam would revise his decision, granting the king permission to have as many horses as is necessary for his personal chariot. So the cavalry is one thing, and for his personal chariot or his personal horse, individual, depending on how it's being translated. But the point here is that the king should be not be adding to his pomp and glory any additional horses. He should just have what's actually required and necessary. And the idea here, again, is that other nations, other kings, they keep adding extra horses for the pomp and ceremony, and that's forbidden for a Jewish king. He has to have what's required, what's needed, and not more than that. We'll find later that he as many as needed for his cavalry, as many as is needed, whatever that amounts to. But that's not about his personal pomp and circumstance. His personal horse, he's allowed to have just what he needs for his horse or for his chariot, or if you interpret his cavalry, then as many as needed for his entire cavalry. Number 4, the king may not amass silver and gold to keep in his personal treasury in order to boost his pride or allow him to glorify himself. He may collect only what's necessary to pay his soldiers, servants, and attendants. So in other words, he collects as taxes and things like that. He can collect whatever he needs for the running of his household and his palace, etc., but not for his own personal nest egg. No. Any gold and silver which he does accumulate should be given to the temple treasury to be kept there, to be ready for use for the needs of the community and for the communal wars. It is a mitzvah to accumulate such treasure troves in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple. The prohibition is only against amassing personal wealth in his own treasure houses. As it says in Deuteronomy, he shall not amass for himself. He should amass wealth for the community, and he should amass. Should he amass personal wealth, then again he gets punishments of lashes. The prohibition is not about collecting taxes. Rather, it's more about his personal fortune, amassing his personal fortune. That he cannot do at the expense of the community. During the time of King David, actually, David HaMelech, he amassed a vast amount of gold and silver to be used for the building of the Beis HaMikdash, for the temple. And in later generations, the temple treasury actually contained the wealth of the nation, and accordingly, it actually became a target. It became a target of enemy attacks because of that. The king is forbidden, number 5, the king is forbidden to drink wine to the point of intoxication. It's not that he's forbidden to drink wine, but to the point of intoxication. As it says in the Proverbs, it's not for kings to drink wine. Rather, he should be involved in Torah study and the needs of Israel by day and by night. That's his job. He is the servant of the community. He is the king. His job is to take care of the Jewish people by day and by night. And so it's not about him. So he should be studying Torah in any other time. As it says in Deuteronomy, it should accompany him and he should read it all the days of his life. So he should be studying Torah and things like that. There's also certain questions of, wine loosens the tongue, and you don't want the king of the nation to whom all the secrets are open. You don't want him becoming intoxicated and sharing secrets. So that's a point of national security. He shouldn't be drinking. Number 6. Similarly, he should not be overly indulgent in his relations with his wife. Even if he has only one wife, he should not be constantly with her. An example is given in Proverbs of a rooster with the hens. He shouldn't be always there. When the Torah forbid the king from accumulating many wives, the emphasis was that his heart should not go astray. And it says in Deuteronomy that, lest your heart go astray. The point here is the king, his heart is the heart of the entire congregation of Israel. And therefore, the verse commands him that he should cleave to Torah to be a greater degree than the rest of the nation all the days of his life. He is an example. He's an example unto the nation. And therefore, it's the responsibility of the king to be setting the example. And for him to be focused on drinking and on relationships is not the point of the king. The king should be setting the highest standards of Torah scholarship, and that's where his time and energy should be. He should be focused on taking care of the people and learning Torah and setting an example of that, because again, he's the heart of the whole nation. It says, actually, there's a commentary, though the heart is one of the smallest organs of the body, it provides for the body's entire energy and life force. Similarly, the king generates and controls the tone of the vitality of the entire nation. Number 7. We've already explained that the kings of the Davidic dynasty may be judged and testimony may be given against them. In other words, the Davidic dynasty, those kings, they are given the authority to be a judge in the courts, and as such, they are also open for judgment against them. That's if you're not open being judged, if you can't be judged, then you can't be judging others, and that idea carries forth. Our sages have taught, correct yourself, and afterwards you can correct others. So were the kings themselves not subject to the scrutiny of a court of law, then they'd have no right to be judging others. However, in regards to other kings of Israel, the sages decreed that they neither sit in judgment or be judged. In other words, they can't be a judge, nor can they be judged. They may not give testimony in a court, nor is testimony in a court given against them. And this is because by and large, they are arrogant, and the matter may cause a tragedy and a loss of faith. So there's actually an interesting discussion amongst the sages, but the sages maintain that the king of the Davidic dynasty, he has the power the judges have the power to disqualify a king from the house of David from judging. However, they never found cause to do so. In contrast, the kings of Israel, when the kingdom was split, the kings of Israel were frequently unheeding of Torah law, and hence they were disqualified from being involved in judgment because it would be a cause of national tragedy in that kind of a situation. It's also a point of honor. You can't put a king on trial, and you can't have a king being judged by judges, because that takes away from the throne. It takes away from the seat of authority. And again, as we said many times before, it's not about the person, it's about the seat. It's about the throne. It's about the person in the role. It's not about the person filling the rank, it's about the rank itself. So the idea here is that you're honoring the king, the throne, not who's sitting on the throne. And that's the important part. And therefore, it's not appropriate for the king to ever be called into a court situation because it's not appropriate for the throne. Number 8. Going back on that for just a second, I think it's important to note that, again, as we talked about previously, the purpose of a king of Israel, it must be remembered that the purpose of a king of Israel is to be an example on how to relate to the King of Kings. And so, in a sense, the king is really just a stepping stone to understand God and have a relationship with God. And therefore, it's critical that we have the respect of the throne, and we create that awe and that awe and that esteem and passion for the person, for the throne, for whoever is sitting in the seat of the throne, in order that we understand that concept of the authority of the king and develop that relationship with the king, so we can then forward on that relationship with God himself, the King of Kings. And so when we talk about all these laws, we have to keep in mind it's about the throne, and it's about the position of the throne being a stepping stone to having that relationship with God himself. Okay, number 8. Anyone who rebels against the king of Israel may be executed by the king, even if the king orders one of the people to go to a particular place and that latter person refuses, or if he orders him not to leave the house and he goes out of the house, the offender is liable to be put to death, and the king may execute him if he desires. As it says in the book of Joshua, whoever rebels against your command shall be put to death. And similarly, anyone who embarrasses or shames the king may be executed by the king, as was the case by Shimei ben Gera, and the whole story about that with King David. Kings may only execute people by decapitation. He may also imprison offenders, and he may also have them beaten with rods to protect his honor. However, he may not confiscate property. If he confiscates property, then that's considered theft. So we have to consider again, the rules still apply many of the rules still apply to the king, but there are some exceptions to the king because of his position of authority and the throne itself, and the importance of protecting the position of the throne. Number 9, a person who negated a king's command because he was occupied with a mitzvah, even a minor mitzvah, he's not liable, because obviously he's busy with respect for the King of Kings, and so therefore he's not liable for disobeying the king. Words have been whose word should be precedent? who's a person who negated a king's command because he was occupied with a mitzvah, even a minor mitzvah, is not held liable, because obviously he is giving precedence to the King of Kings, not the king, right? Whose word should whose word should have precedence in the case of conflict? The words of the master or the words of the subject? And needless to say, if a king decrees that a mitzvah should be negated, then his word should not be heeded. Because again, the king has to be subservient to the King of Kings, God himself. Number 10. A murderer against whom the evidence is not totally conclusive, or who was warned before he slew or who was not warned about the punishment before he slew his victim, or even one who was observed, but he was only observed by one witness, and similarly an enemy who inadvertently killed one of his foes. So those are all situations where the court is going to have a hard time convicting him, because they have very strict regulations as to what you can and cannot do in a court of law. And the Sanhedrin, the high court, has to have two witnesses. Witnesses have to have warned him just prior to his murder, to killing someone. They have to have warned him not only that what the consequences would be, but which form of penalty of consequence it would be. So all these things make it very hard to actually convict someone in a court of law of murder. And in fact, it was even said that a court that does convict someone of murder and gives them capital punishment was considered a hanging court. But there's always times when you know that someone is guilty, you just can't prove it, right? So the king is given the authority to execute someone. He may execute many on a single day, which the court is not allowed. The court's not allowed to convict someone have more than one person killed in a single day. But a king, he may execute many on one day. He may hang them, and he may leave them hanging for many days, in order to cast fear into the hearts and destroy the power of the wicked upon the earth. Generally speaking, in court, if you hang someone or you kill someone and then hang them, they still have to come down before nightfall. And the reason is because that mankind was created in the image of God. And so out of respect for the image of God, it's forbidden to leave someone hanging overnight and into the next day, because it's considered a busha, a disrespect for God himself, as we're created in his image. But a king is allowed to do so because he may come upon a situation where he has to cast fear into the hearts of man and help them, destroy the wickedness of the earth. And so in that case, the king is given the opportunity to, beyond the normal rules. So again, this chapter, chapter 3, is all about some of the rules of the kings to help establish the awe and respect for the position of the king itself. And those are some of the exceptions to the general rules that are given. End of chapter 3.